Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Ruth. I am the President and Senior Consultant here at Tri7 Services. Today we're presenting a three-part video lecture on corporate strategic planning. Much of this material that we'll be presenting in these lectures comes from Dr. Steve Caldwell, who was for a decade or so an executive in the Coca-Cola system. One of Steve's strengths is strategic planning. And one of his roles at Coca-Cola was to lead the business strategy planning for Coca-Cola Consolidated. The processes and paradigms he used at Coca-Cola have been brought to Tri7 Services, which we now use to help our clients. In this presentation, I'd like to summarize some of the key insights in that process of strategic planning. I think you'll find this to be a good deal different than the more conventional approaches to strategic planning. And I think you'll find these differences to be an enlightened breath of fresh air. The first and foremost insight is that strategic planning cannot be done well in the confines of a conference room over a day or two. Instead, it needs to be an ongoing dialogue that's based on a few key, insightful questions. These great questions can be a powerful tool to direct the creative cognitive efforts of senior executives as they work together to identify and address the biggest obstacles to strategic growth in your business. So just to be sure I'm clear about this important insight here, let me repeat myself. Great questions are the key to controlling or directing the corporate dialogue, especially when these great questions are focusing creative energies on identifying and addressing obstacles to strategic growth. So what are these great questions? Where do they come from? How are they framed? Who should participate in answering them? Let's take a look at Dr. Caldwell's process for the answer to these questions. We start with a couple of key concepts. According to Peter Drucker, strategy at its heart is the process by which we improve the way that we create customers for the company. So everything that we're going to talk about in this presentation is framed within this concept of how our company creates customers. We'll start by considering the mission, or if you will, the purpose of the company. It will be a surprise to some to realize that the purpose of the company is not determined by the senior leadership of the company. The purpose of the company is actually determined by the market, which is to say, the purpose of the company is determined by its customers. So here's the first great question. What itch does the customer think we are scratching? What's interesting is if we ask every CXO in the company this question in an anonymous survey, we get lots of different answers. That can't be good. At the most fundamental level, everyone on the leadership team is focused on accomplishing something different from the rest of the team. There is some diversity in the customer base over what itch you're scratching, so some diversity in the senior leadership team might not be as alarming as initially appears. But this underscores the undesirable realization that not all of the senior leadership team is aiming at the same target. What is the target? What is the predominant itch the customer thinks we're scratching? Our marketing program will likely have just one dominant message because fragmented messaging confuses the customers and makes them less likely to buy from us. So here's the first great question. What itch does the customer think we are scratching? Now, how do you answer that question? Usually not by asking the senior leadership team. This is a question you have to get your customers to answer. How to get the customers to answer this question is often a constructive consensus building exercise for the senior leadership team to consider. On a side note, some senior leaders think the primary purpose of the company is to make a profit, and preferably one that's impressively larger than last year's profit. Clearly, the owners, especially of a publicly traded company, think that increasing profits is the primary purpose of your company. But the problem with this perspective is this is not something you can aim at. Profit is a symptom of how efficiently you're satisfying the perceived need of the marketplace. Satisfying the perceived need of your customer base is actually what you need to be aiming at if you want your profits to increase, at least in the long term. Business success in a publicly traded company is often measured by stock price, and the stock price is often a reflection of how many new customers the company is adding. All new billionaires in the last 20 years have headed companies that have focused primarily on adding new customers. And most of them have clearly not focused on being profitable, at least not in the short term. Many of them have had several years of no profits while they watch their stock price skyrocket because of the exponential growth in their customer base. For many businesses, the customer is not the same as the consumer. The customer is the one who makes the decision to purchase, and the consumer is the one who uses your product or your service. For example, the customer for a children's breakfast cereal is the parent who does the grocery shopping. The consumer is the child. The child influences the parent, but the parent makes the final purchasing decision. One of the things that everyone on the senior leadership team needs to understand clearly is who is the customer and who is the consumer, and how does the consumer influence the customer to decide to buy from you, and what else is influencing the customer as they decide to make the purchase decision. The B2B marketplace tends to be more cognitive than the B2C marketplace. So how do we begin to think about this in the B2B marketplace? Perhaps the particular itch that we're trying to scratch is providing the lowest price in the marketplace. After all, in most markets, there's a large segment of the marketplace that wants to buy based on price. Perhaps the itch that we're trying to satisfy is providing the highest quality product. Perhaps the itch that we're trying to satisfy is to provide the best service. For a given product line with a given brand, often it's one of those three in the B2B world. But when you try to get more specific, it is often complicated by the fact that most customers are not even consciously aware of what their itch is, and most itches are more emotional than they are cognitive. At least this is true for your consumers. This can make it difficult to discover the itch that you're scratching. It has been my observation in dealing with many companies over the last 20 years that a lot of companies haven't thought through this question. They can't give a precise answer as to what itch they're trying to scratch. I've found that there will be significant disagreement among the leadership team as to what that itch is. Disagreement among the senior leadership team about what you're trying to do for your customers is detrimental to your company, and it's detrimental to strategic planning. You can't have different leaders in the company with a different impression or different opinion of what your company should be focused on achieving. Lack of consensus will result in C-level executives pulling against each other, which will result in wasted resources and less than optimal performance in the marketplace. If you want to have an effective strategic plan, then reaching consensus on what marketplace itch you're scratching is a non-negotiable first step. This is not easy to do, but it's essential that you reach an informed consensus of what your purpose in the marketplace is. If you do not know what your target is, you cannot be efficient in hitting it. So once we begin to scratch that customer or consumer itch, we're going to run into the environment. And the environment consists of all the things that influence the customers and consumers and influences our ability to deliver on our market promise. These environmental factors present various headwinds, some of which may be strategically significant for the business. These must be identified, assessed for the magnitude of impact, prioritized, and responded to accordingly. There are many types of environmental factors. Let me just list and elaborate on a few of them. One of the environmental influences on our customers and potential customers is the competition. The competition is constantly doing things that change the dynamic of how we create and retain customers. Some important questions that come out of this realization are, who are our primary competitors? What are they doing that will influence our current and prospective customers? Which of those things are important enough for us to respond to? How are we going to respond? The answers to these questions will be part of our strategy. The economy is certainly a big part of the environment that must be considered in our strategy. If the economy is expanding, then we should be doing one thing. If it's contracting, then usually we should be doing something different. So some important questions here are, what is the economic outlook for our markets in the near future? And what should we be doing to address those market shifts? Another factor in the environment has to do with government regulatory changes. What regulatory changes are we expecting or are possibilities that we will have to respond to? How are we planning to respond? If your company has major markets in other countries, this question can be a particularly difficult and expensive one, but it's one that your strategy cannot overlook. Other environmental factors come from societal changes. When the society changes its values or behaviors, it can have a huge impact on various market sectors. In the 1950s, sugar was considered a health food, but then the perception changed and sugar was then considered a health hazard by many. The way people communicate has changed so dramatically over the last 30 years that many new market channels have emerged, and some companies that were slow to take notice no longer exist. Once, gas-guzzling muscle cars were a status symbol, and now that status symbol has passed to smaller electric vehicles. Once it was assumed that all our workers would spend at least 8 hours in the company office 5 days a week, and now some companies operate entirely virtually, and there is no office. The questions that come from this discussion are: what emerging societal changes will have an impact on our markets, our company culture, and our operational costs? How significant will these be, and what should we be doing, if anything, in the next year to respond to these changes? Other environmental changes could be shifts in demographics. They could be major changes in raw material costs, wars, fundamental monetary changes, pandemics, etc. The list goes on. Of course, you cannot always predict all of these factors, but some time spent on understanding what can be understood is better than nothing, and it will help you be in a more competitive position if you have a better understanding of these factors than your competitors do. This is what we mean by the environment, and these are examples of how the environment produces headwinds to your strategic success. And by headwinds, we simply mean the ways in which the environment pushes back on us when we try to scratch that itch. Someone should be asking your leadership team all these questions while keeping the focus on: what are our headwinds? How severe are they? Which are the most important ones we should be responding to, and how should we respond? A proper understanding of the headwinds is one of the things that should be driving your corporate business strategy, because your business strategy needs to be about both moderating the negative impacts of those headwinds as well as intentionally capitalizing on the positive impacts of those environmental changes. We've found that it can be most helpful to ask these questions from a customer perspective. In other words, what kind of pushback are we getting from our customers? Do they insist on a certain level of quality that we're not providing? Do they insist on a certain level of price that we're not providing? Do they insist on a certain level of service that we're not providing? So another way to look at this is: what is it we can do differently to delight our customers? And similarly, what can we do differently to delight our consumers? Where does delight come from? It comes from surprising them with better than they expected. So what are you going to do differently to accomplish that? And here's a related and important question. What is it that our competition is doing to delight its customers that might start shifting our customers away from us to them? Companies spill their guts about their R&D and future services on their website. Sometimes it doesn't take much effort at all to find the answer to some of these questions. A good, thorough search of competitors' websites will oftentimes discover the competitive advantages your competition is attempting to put in place. After all, most CMOs can't resist the temptation to soften up the marketplace to expect the latest and greatest upcoming new products and services. I hope you can see that it is more than just casually important that your senior leadership team clearly understands, with consensus, the answer to all of these questions. With that mandate in mind, it should be evident that an annual one-week strategic planning retreat is probably not the way to go. Some of the most successful companies have a continual year-long process of exploratory investigation to reach consensus on the answers to these questions. This effort is led by a coach who meets with senior leadership team both as a group and individually on a frequent, periodic basis. The result is that your senior leadership will be in a continual process of improving business strategy for your corporation. If you're not using such a model, you might want to consider doing so.